Right now, you're wearing clothes, maybe a shirt, maybe something warmer. You put them on this morning without thinking twice about it. It feels automatic, almost invisible, like breathing, but somewhere, deep in your past, one of your ancestors made a decision that no other animal on this planet has ever made in quite the same way. They covered their skin, and the real reason they did it has almost nothing to do with what you were taught in school. You were probably told it was about the cold. Simple enough, winters got harsh, fur wasn't an option anymore, so early humans grabbed some animal hide and wrapped it around themselves. Problem solved. It's a clean story, it fits in a single sentence, but it doesn't hold up to the timeline. Here's the problem. Humans lost most of their body hair long before they needed clothing for warmth. Fossil and genetic evidence suggests our ancestors were already relatively hairless well over 1 million years before the first clear signs of clothing appear. That's an enormous gap. If clothing were purely a response to losing fur, you'd expect the two to show up close together. They don't. Something else was happening in between. So what filled that gap? To answer that, scientists turned to an unlikely source. Lice. Not the ones you're thinking of. Human body lice, specifically the kind that live in clothing rather than hair. In a study published in 2011, researchers led by evolutionary biologist Mark Stoneking analyzed the genetic divergence between head lice and body lice. Because body lice can only survive in the fibers of worn clothing, the point where they split off as a distinct species gives scientists a rough biological clock for when humans started wearing something regularly. Their estimate placed it at around 170,000 years ago, long after humans lost their fur. Long before the earliest ice ages that would have made warmth an urgent survival issue in most of the regions they inhabited. That timing is strange, isn't it? If it wasn't about staying warm, then why the leading theory has nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with movement? Around that same window in history, evidence shows early humans expanding out of tropical regions and into new environments. New climates, new terrain, new predators, new diseases. Clothing wasn't a response to cold. It was a tool for expansion. A technology, in the truest sense of the word, that let a soft-skinned, slow, physically unimpressive primate walk into environments its body was never built for. Think about what your body actually is without clothing. No thick fur, no natural armor, no claws. Compared to almost every other mammal your size, you are shockingly unprotected. A wolf can walk into a blizzard and keep hunting. You cannot, not without help. Clothing was that help. It let a fragile animal borrow protection it didn't naturally have. This idea is supported by more than lice-genetics. Anthropologist Ian Gilligan has spent years studying the archaeological record of early clothing, particularly the tools used to make it. His research points to a telling pattern. The first solid evidence of complex clothing, things like scrapers for preparing hides and eventually bone needles for sewing fitted garments, appears far more often in colder regions and colder time periods than in warm ones. That part makes sense on the surface, but Gilligan's deeper argument is about what clothing actually did once it existed. It wasn't just insulation, it was infrastructure. Once humans had clothing, they could occupy places that would have been completely off-limits to a bare-skinned primate. Higher latitudes, higher altitudes, colder seasons, longer nights. Clothing didn't just help humans survive winter, it opened entire continents. You start to see it differently now, don't you? Not as a comfort, as a key. And here's where it gets more interesting still. Bone needles, the small sewing tools that let early humans make fitted, tailored clothing rather than simple wraps, don't show up in the archaeological record until around 40,000 years ago. Before that point, clothing likely existed in a much cruder form, animal hides draped or tied loosely around the body. Once needles appear, something changes. Clothing becomes shaped, layered, efficient, and that shift lines up almost exactly with humans successfully pushing into the coldest, harshest regions of Ice Age Europe and Siberia, places earlier hominins had never managed to permanently settle. This wasn't a small technological footnote. This was one of the tools that let your species outcompete other hominins entirely. Consider Neanderthals. They lived in cold European climates for hundreds of thousands of years, and evidence increasingly suggests they used basic hide coverings too. But most researchers now believe their clothing stayed relatively simple, closer to draped hides than fitted, sewn garments. Modern humans arriving in those same regions had something more refined: better insulation, better mobility, better protection against wind and moisture. In an environment where losing body heat could be the difference between life and death, that difference in clothing technology may have been a real survival advantage, one small piece in the much larger puzzle of why modern humans expanded, while Neanderthals eventually did not. It's strange to think about, isn't it? A needle, a few stitches, possibly one small factor tilting the survival odds between two different kinds of humans. But clothing didn't stop at survival. Once it existed, it very quickly became something more. Even in some of the earliest evidence we have, you don't just find plain practical coverings. You find decoration. Pierced shell beads dating back over 70,000 years have been found at sites associated with early Homo sapiens, arranged in patterns, suggesting they were sewn onto clothing or worn as personal adornment. Ochre, a natural reddish pigment, appears alongside some of these early finds too, hinting that even your most ancient ancestors weren't just covering their bodies. They were decorating them, marking them, making them mean something. Clothing was never only about the cold, even at the beginning. It was already becoming a form of expression. That should sound familiar, because it hasn't changed much, has it? Every time you get dressed, you're still doing both things your ancestors were doing 170,000 years ago. You're protecting a soft, exposed body from a world it was never built to survive unaided. And you're saying something about who you are, whether you consciously intend to or not. The color you choose, the fit, the style, the care, or lack of it. All of it traces back to that same dual origin, survival and signal tangled together from the very start. Here's the part that should genuinely surprise you. Humans are, as far as we know, the only species on Earth that has ever done this. Other animals have natural insulation built directly into their bodies: fur, feathers, blubber, layered skin. You don't have any of that in any meaningful way. Instead, your species invented a workaround. An external, removable, endlessly customizable second skin, and it worked so well that it helped carry your ancestors out of the warm regions where humans first evolved and into nearly every corner of the planet, from equatorial forests to Arctic tundra to the tops of the world's tallest mountains. You are quite literally walking around today because some distant ancestor figured out how to wrap themselves in something they didn't grow themselves. So the next time you put on a jacket without thinking, or grab a scarf on your way out the door, consider what you're actually holding. Not just fabric, not just fashion. A tool nearly 200,000 years old. One that let a fragile, hairless primate walk into ice, into snow, into mountains and tundra no other version of humanity had ever crossed. One of the oldest technologies your species ever built wasn't a weapon, and it wasn't a wheel. It was, quite simply, the decision to no longer face the world exactly as your body was born.